Alright, so back to what we were talking about. Papyrus and parchment leather are the most significant for Bible studies because they're the ones that contain the largest amounts of text. And when people are writing and copying the sacred writings, they're using that kind of material. No one is getting out 20 sheets of corrugated steel to copy the first 5 books of Moses, okay, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. No one's doing that. They're using parchment, they're using papyrus, okay? The scroll form was used up to and during the New Testament period, okay? So when we think about a scroll, all of us can visualize that. We saw the picture earlier. You have the photo in your papers of the Isaiah scroll, okay? That's a form that would be used. You would roll it up and you would unroll it, depending upon where you were wanting to go in the text, okay? That's used pretty extensively in the ancient world. It's used all the way up into the New Testament period as well. So you read about, for example, in Revelation chapter 5 and verse 1, Luke chapter 4 and verse 17, we read about a scroll in those 2 verses, okay? That's used up into the New Testament period. The codex form, which is what we call a book, came into use in the 1st century AD, gradually replacing the scroll form. And the rise of Christianity was a huge motivating factor for the development of the codex form, okay? Because scrolls are inherently cumbersome, okay? Because they're big. You have to carry them around. As a matter of fact, you're probably not carrying them around a whole lot. Where are scrolls kept among Jews of the 1st century?
In the synagogues.
In the synagogues, okay? So the synagogue would have a set of scrolls of the Old Testament writings. It wasn't exactly something that you could just pick up and carry with you, okay? If you wanted to take a scroll home, I'm not sure you could do that, but if you wanted to take a scroll home, I want to borrow Isaiah this week. Isaiah would have been a substantially heavy thing to carry. And so the codex form comes along, and in the codex form, it becomes much more portable, okay? So it's no longer a codex just of the book of Isaiah. Now you can have a codex that's going to include all of the Old Testament. And some of the manuscripts we're going to talk about here in the class are manuscripts that contain the vast majority of the Old Testament and would have contained the complete Old Testament when they were originally done. Okay, sometimes those parts are missing in what we have today. We'll talk about all of that later. But the codex form is very, very important, what we call a book. And we still use it. I'm sitting here looking at notebooks. That's the codex form. It's just an updated version that we can add pages and take pages away, right? But it's still a codex, all right? Of course, now what's replacing the book form is what? Digital, okay? Phones, whether it be on a phone or a reader or whatever. Ivana and I went out on a date Friday night, and we were at Barnes & Noble up in South Lake. I love bookstores. I like being able to go in there, have a cup of coffee at their Starbucks. Not very good coffee, but I had coffee nonetheless, and enjoy the smell of books. I don't buy any books there because I'd rather buy it on my Kindle reader where I can make the print really big and read it very easily. I don't carry a paper Bible. Been at Beach for 16 years. I quit using a paper Bible right after I got here. I have it all electronically. Okay, that is the new update to the codex form. And it may come about later that I don't know what the next technological advance will be, but we could expect that something is going to advance in that degree. But this form is very, very what we're used to. And even a Kindle, how many of y'all have a Kindle or a Nook or something like that? Even there, you're what? You click it and it turns the page. You may not see the animation, but you click it and the page turns. Okay, so we're still using this whole idea of turning pages. Okay, came to use in the 1st century, and it caught on. Okay, this was something that caught on. Not only were Christians using it, a whole lot of other folks were using it as well. Okay, it replaced the papyrus. It was a technological revolution, all right, of the ancient world. The next technological revolution took place in 1440. In 1440, a fellow by the name of Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press. This was a huge technological advance, okay? Because up until that time, all books, I say ancient books, it doesn't matter, all books, period, were copied by hand. So here's Stacy over here. She's got the latest New York Times bestseller. And she doesn't have it. Her friend has it, and her friend's reading it. And Stacy says, I really want to read that book. And her friend says, that book costs a lot of money. I'm not going to loan it to you. But we can make a copy of it. And so some scribe is going to be paid to hand copy that book. I want you to think about that for just a moment, how much that would have cost. It would have been very expensive and very time consuming. So up until Gutenberg comes up with the printing press, that's how all books are copied, which means the libraries that a lot of y'all have in your houses would have been printed libraries, would have been libraries that would have been reserved for the very wealthy. Normal people could not have had that. Okay? Normal people would not have had access to that amount of books. Johannes Gutenberg comes along, he invents the printing press, and everything changes because now you can do movable type, and when you do movable type and it is set, you can print lots of copies. What was the first book printed on the printing press, Gutenberg? By now? It was the Bible in German. Okay, it was the Bible in German. I'm pretty sure it was German. Might have been Latin, but I think, I'm not gonna, don't quote me on that, whether it was German or Latin, but it was a Bible. Okay, the very first book printed was a Bible. And so now you've got the ability to put out a mass amount of books. Are they still expensive?
Yes.
They're still relatively expensive because somebody's got to set all that type. Okay, how many of y'all have ever seen with your own eyes a printing press? The old style printing press. You do a page at a time, putting in all those words, okay? And then you can run the pages. And then you have to do the next page, what do you have to do? Reset the type. You don't dump it because then you got to sort it, but you take all that type off, sort it back where it was by letters, and then you got to redo it. Okay? And so you have all of these steps that go into that. So it has become much cheaper, but it is by no means cheap. But what it does is it allows a proliferation of books. By the way, when you mess up and you have a typo in there and you've printed 100 pages, what do?
For the Bible, you destroyed it probably.
Well, you do if you can find them all. We all know the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, correct? Are we all clear on that? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Except they printed a copy of, I believe, the King James. They left out the not. Thou shalt commit adultery. And it went out. Lots of people had that. The king, the king fined the printer for that mistake, and they gathered up probably as many copies as they could find and destroyed them, I would assume. I will tell you now that if you were visiting great-grandma's house and you were in the attic and you found a copy of that Bible that says thou shalt commit adultery, let me assure you, your retirement fund is taken care of for the rest of your life. You will never want for money because that Bible will be sold at a very high price. Okay? Without that mistake, not so much. Okay, but with that, it would be worth a lot of money. It's kind of like that stamp that was done here in America with the airplane and it was done upside down. Those are very, very expensive too if you find one of those. So people are willing to pay big money for that. So all of the books are copied by hand up until Gutenberg. Scribes were professionals, although the quality varied just like among professionals today. Not all professionals are the same, right? Some doctors are better than others, right? Some lawyers are better than others, right? Okay, so it varies, but scribes were considered professionals in the ancient world. They worked in places called scriptoriums, and in those places, one reader would read a text aloud. Multiple scribes made copies of the text being read. So let's say we need 10 copies of the book of Isaiah. One reader is going to read Isaiah out loud. 10 people are going to copy it by hand in their scroll that they're working on, codex, later. Now, normally in this class, I would have what's called a scribal exercise, where all of you would take a piece of paper. I would dictate a Bible verse, not in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but something a little bit more difficult, and I would see and let y'all see how you've done. When I've done that in the past, have we produced 20 identical copies? Never. Okay? Always some changes in spelling because we know Tom over here, he can't spell, right, Tom? So he's going to spell it just kind of how he thinks it ought to be spelled. And Linda, no one can read her handwriting because she was a pharmacist, which is a lot like a doctor, right? No one can read their handwriting. And so we're not going to be able to read anything she writes. And do we put a comma there or a semicolon, or what do we put? And so we will have variations of the verse. Okay? That was true in the ancient world as well. I want you to remember that because that's significant when we talk about textual variants. Okay? Textual variants. I substituted Friday afternoon, and one of the classes I was substituting for was a dyslexia room, and the students were reading a text, and usually students in a dyslexia class have a problem reading the text, so I took the text and was going to read it out loud to them so they could follow along. That text had some typos in it. Okay? They were just misspelled, or they were grammatically incorrect. So what was I doing as I'm reading the text? I was correcting it, and sometimes it was just automatic. Okay? Because you know what should be there in spite of what's on the written page. Remember that as well for when we talk about textual variants. Okay, so that's ancient books and writing. Any questions about that at all?
I was just telling him, I said, that's mean for a kid who has dyslexia to give him a book that's wrong.
Well, yeah. Okay.
But if it was reversed, it would be perfect.
Well, no, dyslexia is a lot more complex than that. Yeah. But the mind has a way of filling in the blanks. If I were to write an English sentence up here, and I will, why not, right?
There's so many other words.
Does not do that. Does not work like that. How do I make that screen blank? Doesn't matter. I'll fill in a white spot over here. So if I'm taking a text and I write, I don't know, something like, what did I just write?
The water is cold.
Good. You filled in the blanks.
The winters are cold.
No, there's a space between WTR and S. Okay? You filled in the blanks. You put the vowels where they belong because you can do that. Our minds are amazing in being able to do this. Okay? Teachers do this all the time because teachers are constantly trying to figure out what students were writing on their papers, right? Even Stacy, who's a college professor, probably does that some. What in the world was this student thinking when they wrote this, right?
They're writing it the way that it sounds.
I wind up making note pages for them because of that.
Okay.
If I can't
So they're not taking notes in your class, you give it to them.
Well, I give them the bulk of the material and they write in a word or two. You see
Okay.
what I'm saying?
Gotcha.
Because I can't count on them to be able to write a sentence.
No.
Okay.
Well,
All right. Well, scribes would have been professional. Okay, they would have been professionals who knew what they were writing. But still, you get mistakes that are made. Okay. So we'll talk about when we get textual variants. So let's talk about the Old Testament from Moses to us, if you will. Go ahead and flip to the next slide. The Old Testament, of course, we know was originally written between 1450 and 400 BC. What is the first book of the Bible? Genesis. Who wrote it? Moses. How many years after creation did he write it? That's a trick question. We don't know the exact number, okay? But clearly, long before Moses was born, okay? So the history goes back farther than that, but it is written, the Old Testament is written between these years, 1450 and 400 BC. It was predominantly written in Hebrew, but with some small sections in Aramaic. They're small relative to the rest of the Old Testament, but they are sizable sections. Where is the largest section in Aramaic in the Old Testament? Anybody know?
Daniel.
It's in the book of Daniel, okay? So Aramaic is a related language. It is not the same. It is like if we take English and German. Hard to believe that English and German are related to each other, right? Yeah, it's really hard to believe they're related to each other, but they are. And so there are some words that are the same or similar, but the grammar is different. Okay, so Aramaic and Hebrew are different languages, but they're related to each other. By the way, that Aramaic in the Old Testament is written in what letters? Hebrew letters. Okay, so unless you happen to know the language, you can be flipping through a Hebrew Old Testament, you would never know the language changed because the letters are the same. So some in Aramaic, but it's predominantly in Hebrew. The earliest known examples of Old Testament texts are the two silver amulet scrolls from Ketef Hinnom that we talked about. Okay, you had a picture of that. Those were found outside of Jerusalem. They date to about 650 BC. They were discovered in 1979, and they contain phrases found in several Old Testament texts, including Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. Okay? So they are not by any means the entire Old Testament, not even close. They are just some verses written on silver scrolls for what purpose?
To ward off whatever bad thing.
To ward off evil. They were amulets. Okay, so it was a very superstitious looking at the text. It was basically a good luck charm. Okay? If I take part of God's word with me, I don't have to worry about anything. Right? People have been doing this since probably sometime after the Garden of Eden, and they still do that today, and we see a lot of that. That's what these scrolls are about. So somebody wanted these amulet scrolls, and they end up being buried in this tomb at Ketaphenim. We get to discover it in 1979. We get to unravel it, and they find that among the other Bible texts, we have Numbers 6, 24 through 26, which is interesting because at least in those verses, it's a witness to the Old Testament text. Okay, 1450, 650 BC. All right. And when we look at this, new copies of the Hebrew Scriptures replaced worn-out copies which were stored in a geniza. Okay? A geniza was a special storeroom for this purpose, located either in a synagogue or at times in a Jewish cemetery. So you would make a new scroll off the old scroll. What happens when a scroll wears out? Well, you'll make a new one. What happens to the old one? You put it in a geniza. Okay, we're not going to throw it in the trash. We're going to put it in a special repository for these things. Sometimes they were buried. Okay, that's important for us because what that tells us is we're not going to have a lot of old copies of Hebrew scrolls because when they made a new one, they were confident enough in the new copy that they didn't have to worry about, we need to keep all the old ones in case we need to go back and look. Okay? Because when the old ones became unusable, it was important to be able to have a new copy. So, again, these are eventually worn out or defective copies were given a ceremonial burial. Okay? The result of these, or the result of this, is that very old manuscripts are extremely rare. Now, very old is a relative term. Do we have any manuscripts from the time of Moses?
No.
No. Do we have any manuscripts from the time of David? No. Okay. Do we have any manuscripts from 650 or 600 BC? What was the date up there? 650? Do we have any manuscripts? No. Okay. We have silver amulets with a couple of verses on them. That's not a manuscript. All right. We talk about manuscripts of the Old Testament. They are much younger than that. As a matter of fact, the really significant Hebrew manuscripts are either the Dead Sea Scrolls or the scrolls that date to about 1000 AD. Okay? 1000 AD. Not 1000 BC, 1000 AD. That's 2,500 years after they're originally comprised. Stacy?
So they found a boarded up geniza in Cairo.
Okay, yeah.
And it's one section of this building, right? And they said that they had lots of these different fragments, like the name of God. It would just be the name of God, and that would go into the... But they actually had... Do you know the one in Cairo? How old the...
I don't know, but they're not going to be...
Would they be Coptic in nature?
No, they're not Coptic. Coptic are Christians. So if it's a Hebrew manuscript and it's in a synagogue, it's going to be Jewish. But there isn't a Jewish community in Cairo before the intertestamental period.
Okay.
So they're not going to get us any older than these. My guess is that they're dating in our era. Okay? So the AD era would be my guess, off the top of my head. They are not as significant as some of the other texts that we have that we'll talk about in a little while.
So this one has 400,000 Jewish manuscript fragments.
Right. Which is a lot, but some of them are nothing more than the name of God, as you indicated. They are fragments. That's not to say they're not important, but they are not as important as the manuscripts we're going to look at.
And it says 6th, so I just looked it up, 6th to the 19th century CE. So
that's us.
That's AD.
Okay, so 600 to 19 to the 1800s. Which would make sense because that's when there's a Jewish population there. Lisa?
What's the proper way for us to dispose of old
In the trash. We need to not, how do I want to say this? We need to not be Jewish in our thinking. That there's something sacred about a piece of paper that happens to have a Bible text on it. Okay? All of this comes from what Stacy pointed out is you've got a little fragment that's got the name of God on there because the name of God's been written, and so therefore we can't destroy that. Okay? It's just printed words on a page. Okay? That's my opinion. What else would you do with it? Where would you go to book, chapter, and verse? We're getting rid of it.
This is why I'm asking the question.
Yeah. I think you throw it in the trash. Okay? It's worn out. It served its purpose. You don't need to make another copy of it because you can go buy another copy of it. And so you dispose of it. Again, it's not what the Jews had. Okay? And remember, the reason we say Lord instead of Jehovah, or however it was pronounced, was because of a very superstitious view towards the name of God. We can't ever say the name of God. And so now we don't know how to say the name of God. That's not what God's word intended. God said, don't take my name in vain. It wasn't, don't ever use my name. Quite the opposite. When Moses says, who do I tell him sent me? God says who. He reveals himself. So Moses would have to use the name. And as they're reading the text, they're saying the name of God, or they're, as they would do later, they're substituting. It's a very, I hate to say superstitious, but it's a superstitious view of these things. Okay? A Bible is a printed book. It's a printed page. Okay? That would be, the next step would be if I can't dispose of my Bible in this way, what about electronic copies of sermons where I read from the Bible? Can those be disposed of? See where you take, if you're not careful, where this can go. Okay. I would say just throw them away. When I left the Czech Republic, I threw some Bibles away. Okay. In the trash can. Todd?
Just kind of on that topic, there are people that put Bibles like in their walls in their house.
Do you know why?
Seems like a vampire thing.
It's to warn off evil spirits. Again, a very superstitious view of these things. We'll put a Bible in the doorstep or in the wall because if we got it there, the spirits can't come in. That's a pretty unbiblical way of looking at things. Okay? But if you're not careful, that's where it can go. I know you cringe at that idea, but at least I can assure you, if you don't dispose of them, at some point in time, someone will. Okay? If they're completely worn out. Right? I've got some old Bibles that were handed down, so there's sentimental value to them, but I also don't use those Bibles. So, hope that doesn't offend anybody, but it's just words on a printed page. It's ink on paper. What's important is what the words say and teach. And by the way, where should that be? Good, in our hearts. Okay, that's where God's word is. It's in our hearts. All right, let's move on. Still looking at the Old Testament, obviously. Then we have the Masoretic text. This is important, okay? Scribes were active during the Old Testament period. We know that, all right? Even though we don't always know a whole lot about what they were doing in the Old Testament, we know they were active. We read about some people who were scribes. Who's a big famous scribe in the Old Testament? Ezra. Okay, good. That activity continued during the New Testament period and later. There was a scribal school known as the Masoretes that was active from about 500 to 950 AD. They were located in Tiberias, which is on the Sea of Galilee. Okay? And that's what these folks did. These folks were scribes. They copied manuscripts of the Old Testament. All right? The Masoretic text itself, these Masoretes provided the Hebrew text with vowels and accent marks. Ancient Hebrew had neither. Okay? So if you look at an ancient Hebrew text, you will not see vowels. If you look at a modern Hebrew text, you will see marks that indicate what the vowels are. All right? That's that whole name of God thing, because it's written with 4 consonants with some other vowels. And when we're not saying it anymore, we forget what the vowels were. And when we forget what the vowels were, we no longer know how to say it. So if someone comes along and says, we have to call God Jehovah, your counter argument would be, or we can call him Yahweh. And you would be completely as much correct as Jehovah is. Okay? Because we really have no idea how the name was said. We know the consonants, we don't know the vowels, except we can piece it together some from Hebrew names that were formed from the name for God. Okay, so I'm looking around here, I'm trying to think. Do we have anybody that's got a name that would be derived from Hebrew? And I am not seeing anybody. Okay. So we can't really use an example here in the class. Isaiah. Anybody know an Isaiah or a Jeremiah? We got Josiah. That'll work. We got two Josiahs. Okay. Josiah, that AH at the end is what? It's coming from the Hebrew name for God. So we can piece things together like that, and we can probably get pretty close, but we don't know with absolute certainty. Okay. Ancient Hebrew had none of those things. The Masoretes came along and said, well, we really ought to supply those vowels and accent marks, and so they do, which is really good for us. They also had a system for checking new copies of the Hebrew Scriptures for accuracy. So they would count the words and they would count the letters in the original, and they would compare it to the copy. Actually, they had standardized lists. They knew how many should be there. They would look for the middle word and the middle letter. Do you know what the middle word of the Bible is? Neither do I. Do you know what the middle letter of the Bible is? Neither do I. It's going to depend upon your translation. Okay? But in Hebrew, they knew it. They knew what the middle word was. They knew what the middle letter was. And so as they're then proofing a text, they would look for those things. And if the new manuscript failed those tests, was it put into circulation? No, we got another manuscript for the Geniza. Okay? Because we can't use that one, because somewhere in there's a problem. We count the middle word, and it's not the middle word that it ought to be. Somewhere there's a problem. Are you going to hunt for that problem and scratch it out? No, you're going to start over. So somebody who's spent a great deal of time copying this sees their work basically shoved away in the storage room. Okay? And you get to start over. All right? By the way, if somebody's paying for your manuscript, are they paying for a faulty manuscript? No. So instead of spending 6 months copying Isaiah, now you're going to spend 12 months copying Isaiah, and you're going to get paid probably the same. So what does that do?
Encourages accuracy.
It encourages accuracy. It encourages being careful. Okay? Because you don't want to do that. All right, here's where we do the scribal exercise. We're not going to do the scribal exercise because we don't have time. Okay? So Hebrew manuscripts from these scribes. One of these that's important is the Aleppo Codex. Notice it's a codex, not scrolls. All right? It dates to the 10th century A.D. It was formerly complete. It is now partially destroyed because there were riots, or the Arabs had riots in 1947, and part of that codex was destroyed. But at least in the past, it was complete. Complete of what? Complete Old Testament. Okay, as a codex. Right. Then we have the Leningrad Codex. By the way, if you wanted to harbor a guess as to where the Leningrad Codex is probably stored. Yeah, it's in Russia. Okay. It dates to 1010 AD, and it is complete. It's a complete copy of the Old Testament. Then we have the Cairo Codex that dates to 895 AD. It contains the prophets. 895 AD. Then we have the Leningrad Codex of the Prophets. It dates from 916 AD. Okay. Then we also have the British Library Codex, which dates to the 10th century AD. It contains the Pentateuch. What's the Pentateuch? First five books of the Old Testament. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. When?
Physically, what size are these books?
Probably, and I'm saying probably because I've never actually seen one of these with my own eyes. Probably about yay big. Okay, they're substantial books. They're not pocket books.
Yeah, I was just wondering. Yeah,
they're substantial.
Sizes.
The paper that's being used is not like our. I mean, think about how a Bible is thick,
Right.
and even if you get it in super thin paper, it's still a pretty thick book. So a codex of the Old, and the Old Testament is the majority of the Bible. So a codex of the Old Testament written on paper that would have been thicker and not printed on a machine that can print really, really small would be a substantial book. The biggest codex of the Old Testament, I guess it's just the Old Testament, is what's called the Gigas Codex. It is massive. Look that up online, Gigas. Okay? Gigas, it's sometimes called the Devil's Bible. Look that up and you'll see why. Okay? That was formerly in Prague. The Swedes, I think, carried it off during the 30 Years' War, off to Sweden. And I think that's where it is today. Don't quote me on that as well, because I did not look up that information for the purposes of this class. But they're substantial books. These are not small books. Okay? Any of y'all ever been to an old library, a really old library, like in Europe, that's got all these really old books? They're usually pretty substantially sized books. Okay? Even when you have a printing press, they're pretty substantially sized.
Could it be multiple books that, like, you know how they do encyclopedias sometimes? You know,
Don't go away. Hold that thought. Just don't go away.
Like volume one.
We should all get up and leave.
You'd be surprised if people don't be so long.
snuck over the other class real quick.
Yeah, wherever they were.
Fell down there.
It had to be. Yeah, I think it would be too big.
Are you his keeper?
You don't want to misbehave. All right, I'm going to put this up here. Feel free to look at it on your way out if you want to. This is a page from a 1506 Bible, printed in Venice, and it's actually from a Czech Bible, and it's a page from the book of Joshua.
Wow.
So that gives you an idea. That's a printed page, okay, as to how large a codex would have been. So think those dimensions multiplied. You are printing front and back. That does have a back to that page. I chose the nicer side to put on the glass, but that would be something that I think is fairly typical size-wise, a little bit bigger. Some books are smaller. I also have a page from the book of Psalms, which is about the size of my iPad. Okay, but it was only the Psalms. It was only a book from the Psalms. When you're talking about the whole Bible in one codex, it's a substantial book, and so you would have pages. These were, even with Gutenberg, and this is a printed page, this is not a manuscript, okay? This is a printed page. Even with Gutenberg, you're still talking about things that are going to be expensive. They're going to be in churches. They're going to be in libraries. Noble families would have them. This is not something you would never find probably at all in a peasant's hut. Because people who were living hand to mouth are not buying copies of this. But they would have been things that would have been on display that people can actually look at, maybe members of the family can look at. They would have been housed in these libraries. So it's a substantially sized page. And by the way, when I talk about that these are not terribly expensive, I probably paid about $30 for that page. Okay, framing it cost me more.
Yeah.
The frame and the glass that I framed it myself cost more than the page did. You can buy careful. You can buy old manuscript pages, all right? But be careful because it's really easy to get burned buying something that isn't real, okay?
Made in China.
But you can buy.
Stamp on the back.
No made in China stamp on the back. But so you have a look at that on your way out. I've got several of these. I've got some at home as well that are a little bit nicer. I've with ones at home that are actually illustrated in color. How do you get a colored illustration on a printed page?
Gotta use different inks.
Not with those. Well, that one might be with the large letter there, but when they put an illustration in there, they are actually going back and adding that, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, painting.
Not woodcuts, they're actually painted, they're actually in color. Okay? So about that size is what you're looking at when you're looking at these codexes, multiplied. Some of them are large. You can look this up online as well. If you look up the Leningrad Codex on Wikipedia, I feel pretty confident it's going to give you the dimensions. Okay, how big it is. All right. So let's see. Time-wise, we already have our first bill.
No.
The bells may not be running because we're at 42, and I think we already get one by now, but we'll see. All right, so the next significant thing to talk about with the Old Testament are the Dead Sea Scrolls. The first 7 of these scrolls were discovered by a Bedouin shepherd boy, a young man, in 1947 in a cave near the Dead Sea. He threw a rock into the cave because that's what little boys do, right? They throw rocks. And he heard something break. And so he went to investigate and found a shattered clay jar with manuscripts in it. He found 7 of them. And you know, I don't care what these are, but I bet they're worth money. And they were. So, from 1949 to 1956, fragments of 931 additional manuscripts were discovered in 10 other caves down in the area around the Dead Sea. The scrolls date to roughly 250 BC to 68 AD. That is the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Okay? New discoveries are still possible. In fact, as they go back and sift through the caves, they do make new discoveries. There are lots of caves around the Dead Sea. These particular caves were used during the Jewish revolt, 68 AD, when these folks are hiding their valuables. Okay, things that are valuable to them. There's a community down by the Dead Sea, there was, called the Qumran community. This is likely their library, and they hid it in the caves so the Roman soldiers wouldn't burn them. So when this nasty war is over and we have won, we can come back and get our library out of the caves. By the way, the fact that they're still in the caves tells us
They were destroyed.
they were destroyed. No one ever came back for them. It's interesting reading because in these caves they have found things like property deeds, marriage contracts. You read these things and you know these people never came back for these things because they weren't alive to do so. Anytime you find something like that buried in the ancient world that's valuable and no one ever went back for it, you know basically what happened to the people that they belonged to. All right. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, let's continue on. They're mostly written in Hebrew, some are in Aramaic, and a few also in Greek. The texts include biblical texts, very important for our purposes, texts from the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. These are Jewish writings of the intertestamental period and the first century that are not a part of the Bible. Okay? They're Bible stories type material, but they're not Bible stories because they're not inspired. So some of those are in those caves as well. There are commentaries and writings about biblical text. It wasn't just that Jewish people had the Bible. They wrote commentaries about the Bible, just like people do today. And some of these Dead Sea Scrolls are actually commentaries. What's important for us is that in writing their commentary, they would often quote from
The text.
the text. Okay, so it's another witness. That was our first bell, I hope. There are also some documents that are uniquely Essene. The community down there at Qumran are the Essenes. They are the one of the 4 sects of the Jews from the first century that is not mentioned in Scripture. They're the only one. Okay? These were these folks down around the Dead Sea. They were kind of strange. Okay? They didn't get married. All right? Which is why there probably weren't very many of them. And most of them lived down by the Dead Sea, although there were apparently some in Jerusalem. They thought that even the most conservative Jews in Jerusalem were liberal. So we're going to be even more conservative than them, right? And they went off on the deep end. And you can choose whether it was this deep end or that deep end. They were off the deep end, okay? But they had some uniquely Essene documents as well. Their community rule. They were basically monks down there in the desert, okay? Down there around the Dead Sea. But what they really did for us that's really great is they gave us this. Not for the Essenes, we probably wouldn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's good that we have them. All right, so let's look at the Hebrew Bible timeline. So we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're back here 250 to 68 AD. Then we have the Cairo Masoretic text 895, 916, 10th century, 1010 AD. Notice with me, if you will, that there is a gap of how many years? Roughly?
1,000 years, a little over.
Roughly 1,000 years gap between them. Okay? That's significant because we have these texts, What's happened over 1,000 years? Did they get changed? Here's a question for you. Did they get changed?
Yes.
The answer to that would be there are some textual differences. And when you're following along in your English Bible and you have a footnote, and the footnote says DSS, that's Dead Sea Scrolls. And if it has a word out there in italics or something like that, that's telling you that the Dead Sea Scrolls has some information that's not in these, and the translators chose to go with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Are the Dead Sea Scrolls necessarily more accurate? No. Okay, they're not necessarily more accurate because they're subject to the same issues with textual variants that the Masoretic texts are. But what we have done is we have been able to see that from these texts to this text, there are very few and probably none that are substantial changes. So if you go 1,000 years from here to here and the text is preserved, then you go 1,000 years back, you're at the time of Moses. What can you extrapolate from that? Probably the same thing. When you've got people that respect the Word of God, to the point of superstition, back to Lisa's earlier question, to the point of superstition, they're very careful with copies of it. If we see that here it's been transmitted accurately, we have pretty good reason to believe it's been transmitted accurately since the time of Moses. It's an indirect form of evidence. All right, so let's look at the Hebrew Bible. Let's look at it this way. We have the Masoretic text, witnesses to it. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew before 68 AD. We also have the Septuagint. We haven't talked about that, but in the intertestamental period, the Old Testament in Hebrew is translated into Greek. Why? Because lots of Jews don't speak Hebrew anymore, but they speak Greek, so they want the Bible in their language. That's just like we have our Bibles in what language this morning? English. Everybody's using English, right? Probably most of us are at any rate. Well, in Jews in the intertestamental period wanted it in Greek because we don't speak Hebrew anymore. We don't read Hebrew. Let's have it in Greek. So it's translated 2nd century BC. A translation is a witness to this text because if you speak both languages or can read both languages, you can go back and extrapolate what the original said. Believe it or not, you really can. Okay? Because I function in a multilingual environment between English and Czech. Sometimes I can see an English translation from Czech that's gnarly. I can know what the Czech was behind that, even if the English translation is bad. And if I can find a copy of the Czech, I can verify that. Then we have the Peshitta, which is the Old Testament in Syriac, which is yet another language. It dates to about 200 AD. That is a witness to the Masoretic text. And then finally, for purposes of the ancient world, we have the Latin translation, because lots of Christians in the first century weren't speaking what? They weren't speaking Greek because they're in the Western Roman Empire. And so, hey, let's have the Old Testament in Latin. And so it's translated. This is a Christian work. Christian work, Christian work, Jewish work, Jewish work. Okay? Translated in Latin, 300 to 400 AD. And again, you can compare it to the Masoretic text. All of these are witnesses. And the more witnesses you have, the better. The more witnesses you have, the better. All right, we're going to pick up right there Wednesday night, New Testament manuscripts.